Conversation with the Candidates continues right now.
Thank you for clicking on our extended conversation with the candidate, with Democratic candidate for President Marianne Williamson. The next half hour is totally commercial free, so we can get to as many questions from New Hampshire voters as we possibly can. Let's get things started with Leonard Morrill.
Good afternoon. How would you try to reduce the budget, the deficit, without harming Social Security or Medicare?
You just don't touch them. You just don't touch them. That's not where the money should come from. And we should lift the cap on Social Security, and we should have universal health care, Medicare for all. Now remember, when you have an investment in anything that contributes to people's lives, it's called a peace economy. Any dollar that is invested in health, any dollar that is invested in education, or anything that enables people to expand their horizons actually expands your economy. The more people are educated, the more they stand to be able to earn money, the more people have health care, the more they stand to work in jobs that they love, and human creativity is stimulated, human productivity, and that's where money comes from. So it's not only an issue of what are we going to do with the money we have, but it's an issue with wealth creation. And it's interesting that some of the forces that will not talk that way when it comes to public money, sure as heck talk about it when it comes to their own money.
So what would you reduce to lower the deficit? Is there a program that you would eliminate?
All right. So one of the things, for instance, that Speaker McCarthy didn't want in the debt negotiations, interestingly enough, while he was calling this fiscal responsibility, right? The president had wanted to spend money to have more IRS agents to go after very, very wealthy tax cheats. We know that very, very wealthy Americans are creating all kinds of and taking advantage of all kinds of loopholes, and that if these loopholes were closed, we would be bringing billions of dollars into the U.S. economy. Oh, he didn't want that. We should be cutting out these subsidies. We pay billions of dollars in subsidies to corporations that are already making billions of dollars in profit. Yes, we should have a wealth tax. If you have over $50 million a year, I don't have any problem with asking you for another 2%. It will not ruin your day. And if you have $1 billion in assets, yes, give another 1%. Also, there should be a great reduction. The government itself, agencies of the government itself, say that you can take that $858 billion military budget that we have, you could cut 10% of that with no change whatsoever. I think we could, and that would save. I think we could cut 20%. There was recently an expose on 60 Minutes where it was made clear that the defense industries are price gouging the U.S. military. Not only are they price gouging, but there is no accountability whatsoever. All accountability, they've been basically told self-regulate for decades now. They fail every audit, and that would be one of the first things I would do as president, is to demand an audit of every cent spent by the Pentagon. These are the kinds of places. I would take it from places where there is waste, where there is money just given for no reason. I would reinvest that money. So on one hand, you have a reduction in your expenditure. On the other hand, you have expenditures that actually expand the economy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question comes from George Matthews.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Tell me your position on abortion.
My position on abortion is that there are issues of private morality and public morality. And I think that abortion is an issue of private morality. I do think it's a moral issue. But I trust the moral decision-making of the American woman. Except for the issue of sex with children, I don't think the government should be telling you what to do with your body. I believe that abortion is an issue of private morality, and women should be trusted to make that decision. In fact, what we are seeing right now, since the Dobbs decision, is a lot of the terrible things, medical situations and circumstances that women are going through, just like people warned us, are already beginning to happen. You know, when I was growing up, everybody knew that the issue of abortion wasn't whether or not it was legal. It was the fact that rich women had safe abortions and poor women had back alley abortions, and we're creating that same kind of hardship for women right now.
Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up, Ms. Williamson. What kind of law might you sign to protect abortion as president?
Well, you know, unfortunately, the Democrats should have codified it when we had the opportunity to, and the Democrats did have time when they could have. This would depend on if I had a Democratic House and Senate. If I have a Democratic House and Senate, I say get rid of the filibuster if you have to, and go on and codify. If I don't, the president does not have a magic wand. Nor should the president have a magic wand. There would be a limit if I don't have a House and a Senate. On the other hand, I think that if people are at the place where, yeah, we're going to make her president, people will be awakened to the need to elect a different kind of congressman and senator, too.
Next question comes from Hella Ross.
Nice to see you. Thank you for being here. Thank you. As president, what strategy would you employ to address China's recent ongoing negotiations with Havana about setting up a joint military training facility in Cuba?
Do you know how many military bases we have surrounding China? 313. Americans need to wake up. It is a different world. We have about 750 military installations in 80 countries. The fact that other countries are saying, you're going to do that to us, we're going to start doing it to you. That's the world that we live in now. So I think that that's what China is saying, and China is basically taking that posture. I don't want to see Chinese military installations in Cuba, but I also realize, as I'm sure Anthony Blinken and President Biden realize as well, it's a new day. You can't just go around telling people what to do. And there are enough military installations that should not exist that are American in the world and that I would want to close, not at the expense of our safety. On the other hand, I don't believe the fact we have all those military bases is making us safer. I think that we have squandered our safety by this militarization of the world. But they don't like the fact that we have so much going on in the South China Sea. Just like we don't like that they might be coming to Cuba. It's called a negotiation, and that's the world today.
Just a quick follow-up on that one, Ms. Williamson. Even though there are many more American military bases surrounding China, do you think there's a difference in intent between what America is trying to do and what China is trying to do with its bases?
On one hand, now let's talk about this very seriously. On one hand, I'm not naive about China, okay? Nobody's naive about China. But look how the rest of the world sees this. The rest of the world is looking at Iraq. The rest of the world is looking at the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And do you think that they see China as a greater military threat to global security, or the United States as a greater military threat to global security? Let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. As president, I will help this country look in the mirror. The American people are not stupid. And my experience of the American people is that if you have something wrong in your family, we can take the truth. We know how to be mature adults, and we know how to fix things. But the political system in both parties doesn't want you to look at what's really true and what's really going on. And as your American president, I would do that. So we have to look at how the rest of the world sees this. We are a multipolar world now. It is no longer unipolar. There was a time when America could just go around doing whatever we wanted, and we squandered our military authority by doing that. We squandered by our moral authority by doing that. We squandered our safety by doing that. We squandered the lives of our own men and women and people around the world by doing that. And at this point, we have to step back, become far more humble. We can't continue to look at the world as everybody as an enemy. You know, sometimes, we're going to need to collaborate with China. We're going to need to collaborate with these other countries to deal with nuclear power, to deal with climate change, and to deal with AI, to be honest. So this posture of us versus them, and we're going to play tough guys and that kind of toxic masculinity, cowboy stuff in American foreign policy will end with me. And I am a woman who, you mess with my children, you're going to have to, I can be very, very tough. You mess with this country, I can be very, very tough. But our foreign policy has not been based on serious security decisions so much as it has been based on the profitability factors of a U.S. war machine and the military-industrial complex. We're going to become far more mature and far more wise when I'm president.
Next question comes from Charles Jesse.
Hello. For 20 years, Pew Research has characterized four left-leaning political typologies: progressives, establishment liberals, democratic mainstays, and outsider left. from left to center. I was surprised 2 years ago, progressives were only 6% of the adult population and 12% of the Democrats. Where do you think you can find your base, the smaller but louder progressive left or the much larger electorate?
You know what? They have done poll after poll, and this is the deal. There are all kinds of people who, if you ask them about what you and I would call a progressive issue, Medicare for all, gun safety laws, tuition-free college, they might say, I'm a conservative, but they actually like that issue and will say, yes, they want that. Now, then when you say to them, well, you know, some Democrats stand for that, they go, oh, no, I'm not a progressive Democrat. So I'm sure you know that. So we have got to burst out of our silos. We've got to burst out of these, I'm this and I only stand for that. That doesn't apply to where Americans live these days. Americans aren't thinking, the vast majority of Americans aren't thinking, well, I'm a conservative, so I should think this, or I'm a liberal, so I should think that. They're thinking, how am I going to pay for health care? How am I going to send my kids to college? And I hope that people will feel that that's the place I'm coming from, because to be honest, it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question coming from the realms of the online here. Phil asks, how would you solve the national debt crisis?
Well, this, of course, question already came up. Remember when President Clinton left office, we had a balanced budget. So obviously we have an issue, but the issue is, first of all, there's a lot of canard about debt spending too. It's not always the worst thing that you can do. And at this point, what we have to do is right people's lives. We need to spend the money that it will take to right people's lives, and everything else will come from there, because that will grow our economy. We need to stop spending money on just making it easier for those who already have to get more. We need to stop it with all the subsidies. We need to have a wealth tax. We need to stop all the ways that we create deregulatory issues. You know, one of the things that the far right would have you think is that regulations actually are job-cutting regulations. In many cases, these, not even to mention the fact that they're actually safety regulations and they're health regulations, but they're also job-creating regulations. So I'm more worried about the moral crisis. I'm more worried about the health crisis. I'm more worried about the job crisis. I'm more worried about the education crisis. I'm more worried about the child care crisis. I'm more worried about the housing crisis. And people have to not have to, you know, the people who are saying, what are we going to do about the debt crisis, aren't worried about those things. And if we worried more about those things, we wouldn't have the debt crisis.
Next question comes from Brian Harlow.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Our state is still in the midst of an ongoing opioid crisis. Many are rightly focused on prevention and treatment, yet what would a Williamson administration do for all the grandparents stepping up to raise traumatized children of those addicted?
You know, the money in this country, first of all, we should treat all drug issues. I believe in decriminalization of everything, and I believe that we should treat the drug issue the way countries like Portugal do. We should treat these issues as a health crisis. There are other countries that have far better results by doing that than by criminalizing these things. And one of the reasons why these grandparents have to step up, sometimes it's because of the death of someone, sometimes it's because of the incarceration of someone. We have far too many people in our jails for nonviolent drug offenses when they should be at home raising their children and restarting their lives. The government should be spending far more resources. Remember, this is this whole issue of government should be spending its money helping people repair their lives was necessary in order to self-actualize and live the lives that will make them decent contributors to the society in which we live. Right now we have a crisis, a serious crisis, and where we have a serious crisis and the government needs to be involved in helping people get to the other side of it, then that's what the government should do.
Another viewer question coming in here. Do you have political figures that inspired you?
Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Jefferson, and Martin Luther King Jr.
I know you mentioned declaring yourself an FDR Democrat a lot.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
When Franklin Roosevelt became president, the United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. And it was his wife who said to him, Franklin, his wife Eleanor, who said, we need more than the alleviation of stress. We need fundamental economic reform. And the president said these things which have meant so much to me. He said, he talked about the 4 freedoms. And the 4 freedoms to him were the freedoms of speech, obviously, the freedom of protest and religion, and then he said the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. He said a necessitous man is not a free man. And that's what I've been talking to you about today. There are too many necessitous people in this country. And if you are living, just barely holding on at a job that you hate, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs that you hate, just so that maybe you can put food on your table, in a very real way, Franklin Roosevelt said, and I agree with him, that person is not free. The President Roosevelt also wrote an economic Bill of Rights, and I have taken from those ideas, and I have a 21st century economic Bill of Rights that people can see on my website at marianne2024.com. He believed in using the powers of government to serve the people. Remember, as I said to someone earlier, this is not free anything. This is your tax dollars that we're talking about. All we're talking about is how your money is spent. We're not talking about the nanny state doing for you. No, you're feeding them, and they work for you and not the other way around. American people have been trained to just expect too little and to forget. If our Declaration of Independence says that we are given, God-given, inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then the Declaration goes on to say that the government is instituted to secure those rights, and that when the government is not doing its job, it's the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. We're just acquiescing to a system that amounts to a level of corporate tyranny. We have, at this point, a corporate matrix. Insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, big food companies, big agricultural companies, big chemical companies, big oil, gun manufacturers, and defense contractors. And they're like a matrix of corporate aristocracy. They're treated like the landed gentry in Old England. We repudiated that in 1776, and it's time for us to repudiate it again. Everybody else is turned into almost like a level of serf, while they are considered more entitled. They get theirs first, and then whatever is left for the public sector, no, we have to make an economic U-turn. So I don't even remember what the question was. Oh, Franklin Roosevelt, yeah. So let me tell you, so everything I just said is in line with the Rooseveltian principles, which is the traditional pillars of the Democratic Party, an unequivocal advocacy for the working people of the United States. I want this for the children of the United States, for the poor of the United States, for the workers of the United States, for the students of the United States. Now, did those forces, those same corporate forces that I just mentioned, did they come after Franklin Roosevelt? Yes, they did, and vehemently. He called them the economic royalists. And you know what he said? He said, I welcome their hatred. And that's what I would say, too.
A traitor to his class, he was called, right?
That's why he's my hero.
Laura Landerman Garber has our next question.
Welcome back to New Hampshire.
Thank you.
Last we spoke, one of my friends here asked one of our New Hampshire voters. We were together, and she asked, what would you first do when you got to the White House and D.C.? And if I recall correctly, you said you would soften D.C.
I would what?
Soften D.C., and you would paint the Oval Office pink, saying that it would soften the edges of that office. Are those still your priorities, and symbolically, perhaps? And if not, what are your top 3 priorities for a Williamson presidency?
On the serious level first, and then we'll get to the more fun stuff about how to decorate the Oval Office. First thing I would do is cancel the Willow Project. The Willow Project is an $8 billion ConocoPhillips oil extraction project up on the north slopes of Alaska. The president likes to brag about the money of the green investment in the Inflation Reduction Act. Even though those are healthy and good investments, they are completely nullified by the money that we're spending on the Willow Project. Young people particularly are horrified by this. For those of you who are Democrats or left-leaning Democrats, I contend that our biggest problem is not Donald Trump for 2024, it's how many people, particularly young people, would just choose to stay home. The president has given more oil drilling permits than even Donald Trump did. So that's the first thing I would do. I would also, as I mentioned earlier, start to audit every cent spent by the Pentagon. I would cancel all contracts that the government has with union-busting companies. I would deschedule marijuana from a Schedule I drug. I would call Senators Tim Scott and Cory Booker into the Oval Office. I would say, you guys can bring whoever you want, but we're not leaving here until we have hashed out a bipartisan bill on police reform and dealing with that issue. And after I had done those things and also started the work on the establishment of a Department of Peace, starting to put together also, I want to have an amazing conclave of the greatest experts on childhood. American children are in trouble. American children are in crisis, and that includes some of the children here in New Hampshire. We now know things about the brain of children that we didn't even know 10 years ago, neuroplasticity, et cetera. I want a major transfer of resources into the lives of children 10 years and younger. So I want to start saying, okay, get me those people. I want to hear, what do the brain scientists have to tell us? What do the educators have to tell us? Who are the people who know the most about early childhood? If we want an amazing economy 20 years from now, we're going to take better care of our children who are 10 years old and younger now. And I just have to say one thing before I leave on that and get to the Oval Office. You think we have a mental health crisis now? We are now raising a generation of children in elementary school who go to school every day praying they will not be shot today. You think we have a problem now? So that stuff gets addressed when I'm there. Okay, now, the Oval Office. I don't know about softening Washington. There are many wonderful, good people in Washington. It's the systems that are the problem. However, I have to tell you, I would get rid of that desk. It can go into a warehouse for a while, and it would have a more feminine look. Yeah, a woman is here. Yeah, the decor would say, I always say, we need a mother in the White House. You can take that however you want.
Thank you so much.
Next question comes from Thalia Flores.
Hi, welcome. In January 2020, you and several other strong candidates...
I'm sorry, ma'am, could you talk a little louder?
Of course. In January 2020, you, along with several other strong candidates, suspended your campaign prior to the New Hampshire Democratic primary. What did you learn from your first presidential run, and what will you do differently to gain the support you need to stay in the race in 2024?
I'm going to tell you something interesting. One of the things I regret is that I dropped out of the New Hampshire primary. And I'm going to tell you a little gender something that you might find interesting, okay? The women in my life were, Marianne, enough is enough. You're out of money. You can't do this. They're so mean to you. It's so awful. You've suffered enough. I can't stand it. Let it go, sweetheart. Let it go. The men in my life were, don't you get it? There's still time on that clock. And it was kind of funny because they were all using sports analogies, and I know very little bit about sports. Joe Louis, he regretted till the day he died. He should have gotten up one more time. You still have, and it was so funny. And you know what? The men were right. In that case, the men were right, actually. So I learned something. You know, there's a lot of times people talk about the divine feminine. Well, there's a divine masculine. So I learned that in a lot of ways. And on that, what I learned was people said about New Hampshire, people start to focus just that in that last month. So I do regret leaving. In terms of what I've learned, it's a very difficult experience. People lie about you, people smear you, people make fun of you, people insult you, people mischaracterize you, but you get emotional antibodies. And so you want to have a tougher skin, but not let it make you tough. So the main thing I have learned is a kind of emotional posture, what to ignore. A friend of mine said to me very early in the process, she said, keep your eyes on the light of the fire. The things that you and I are talking about here today are important. Martin Luther King Jr. said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter most. So what I saw when I ran before is exactly what I am seeing now. The system, what I call the political media industrial complex, is even more corrupt and in a way more vicious than I feared. The people are even more wonderful than I hoped. We talked about some very serious things here today, and I didn't feel that any of us weren't up for it or up to it. And that's very inspiring to me. And so my last race actually it didn't make me more cynical. It made me cynical as I already was about how that system operates, but it made me even more inspired by and committed to the foundational principle of the United States, that, as Jefferson and other founders said, the only power that we should rest upon and feel is strong enough to govern this country is the will of the people. The will of the people. And I'm even more committed to that than ever.
Thank you.
And more convinced that it's the only thing that will save us now.
Another online question, this one from Andrew Dow, who asks, how do we unify the country when there are so many themes to divide? How do we get actual equality in our times of political and social division by race, color, beliefs, and identities?
I have two very close women friends. One a very close personal friend, and one a very close professional associate who has worked with me for something like 30 years. And by that time, you know, when you work closely with someone, they become a level of personal friendship. And they are both ardent Trump supporters. And I have felt that it was a gift to me that they have been in my life, always reminding me what matters. And with one of them, we decided very early, we're just not going to discuss it. We won't be talking about politics. With the other one, we had to work on the relationship. But I remembered the thing that mattered to me most was that in both of those relationships, they have been there for my child as she grew up. And I hope they feel I have been there for them. And they have reminded me that politics is not everything. Politics is not everything. There is the Persian poet Rumi who said, out beyond all ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, there is a field. I'll meet you there. That's where we have to meet one another in this country. No one has a monopoly on truth. All of us, on the left and the right, the self-righteousness, the sense that I'm right, they're wrong, I have moral values, they don't. That's darkness within our own hearts. And also, Martin Luther King said something else. He said, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. So the first thing you have to clear is your own arrogant self-righteousness, sense that you know better, and meet people in a place of just openness. And then, you know, nobody, as I said, nobody has a monopoly on truth. Not only that, we all get to own this country. People do not owe it to you to agree with you. And I find that when I remember that, then people like to feel respected. That doesn't mean people necessarily expecting you to agree with them, but we all deserve respect and validation. You know, some of the most important work that's been done, people like Christian Ciccolini, I forget his name, please forgive me, the gentleman who used to be a Nazi, and then he was awakened and he was de-radicalized. He now goes back and he talks to people who are Nazis, and he finds humanity, and he finds that place where we're all human, and he's had some amazing things happen. You know, we have to hold the space that we're all, we have to hold a deeper space of honor, and we have to be willing to see the humanity in another person. That doesn't mean people are not held accountable. Don't get me wrong. I'm a Jew. There are people who were walking the other day in front of a synagogue with Nazi flags. I don't minimize what that means. Don't get me wrong. People must be held accountable as well. But we all have to get off our high horses, I think, and talk not just to people who agree with us, but to people who do not agree with us as well, with some generosity of spirit and even love.
Quick follow-up question on that one. What about social media? Some people view it as totally corrosive to our civic process, but it can be good at times too. As president, how would you approach it?
It's terrible. You know, when I was younger, okay, it's not like anybody in this country thought we didn't have racists, or we didn't have bigots, or we didn't have homophobes, or we didn't have anti-Semites. Obviously, we've always had them. But when I was growing up, there did seem to have formed a social consensus that voices like that would not be given major megaphones, that no major political party would be given major megaphones to those people. They seemed to be pretty much on the fringes of society, and everybody knew they did not belong in the center of American dialogue. And then something happened. Something pretty terrible happened, and it had two pieces to it. One, political forces, and I believe one particular one, who was not above harnessing some of those perspectives for his own political purposes, and social media. And so what has happened is the guardrails, there are no more guardrails. The levees have fallen. And it is terrible. On one hand, we know, first of all, you know, the internet is here to stay, so we know that. We know that it has some very good things happen because you can look up almost anything on the internet. We also know that some terrible things are happening there. We do. So at a certain point, even though I believe there should be regulations on tech companies, we do have very serious issues to think about in terms of First Amendment rights and so forth. I remember, for instance, when Sacha Baron Cohen was saying, when the question was whether or not former President Trump would be deplatformed from Twitter. Remember when that was all the conversation? And I remember that Sacha Baron Cohen said, if Hitler were alive today, he would be taking out 30-second ads on Facebook. And I remember how horrified I felt because I thought, you know, he's right. So it's a serious issue. On the other hand, the issues of freedom on the internet are very serious as well. Bottom line, we all have to repair ourselves. There needs to be an ethical revolution in this country. Governmental power cannot be used like a bludgeon. It cannot be used like a meat cleaver. No amount of government action is going to compensate for a lack of ethics and a lack of human character. And we need to be about the business of making sure that our children are taught issues of character, our children are taught issues of integrity, that we talk to our children about what it means to be a good person. We will be a violent society until we decide to be a nonviolent society. It's like the issue of guns. There are countries that have as many guns as we have and don't have these mass shootings and so forth. So the issue is that we have to address issues of violence in our foreign policy, issues of violence in our economic policies, and even issues of violence in our own hearts. There is violent speech. Meanness is violence. When you make just mean comments about people on the internet, that's violent. So we have to have, as Martin Luther King said, we have to have quantitative shifts in our circumstances and qualitative shifts in our souls. We need both inner and outer change in order to transform our country.
All right. Not trying to be mean, but that's the end of our time.
Okay, thank you.
Marianne Williamson, thanks so
Adam.
much for joining us on
Thank you,
Close Up.
everyone.
Thank you for watching here and participating in our studio audience, and thanks for watching at home.